Boa noite. Boa noite às pessoas que vão chegando. Ah, let me first. Okay. Let me first send the Twitter info. Boa noite a todos e a todas. Sejam bem-vindos a mais um broadcast da Rede Metagame. Hoje num esquema super especial aqui com a presença do querido Phillip Penix-Tadsen, que é professor da Universidade de Delaware e tem um trabalho muito interessante dentro dos estudos culturais, trabalhando com América Latina, com relações de poder e com videogames. Phillip muito graciosamente aceitou fazer essa fala aqui pra gente, nisso que a gente está chamando de Metagame Speaker Series, que é uma tentativa de trazer esses caras que são super importantes no campo dos Game Studies para conversar com a gente aqui no Brasil, ou seja, fazer meio que para a gente poder ter uma forma de estabelecer um diálogo mais sistemático com essas pessoas. Então, sem muito mais delongas, as coisas vão funcionar da seguinte forma, pessoal. Vou passar a palavra para o Phillip. Ele vai falar há algum tempo e a gente vai seguir depois num Q&A, né? Num debatezinho. Eu vou trazer o Ivan aqui para debater com a gente também e a gente vai fazer a mediação aí dessa conversa com o Phillip com base na pesquisa dele. A fala do Phillip se chama The Poisonous PlayStation, Video Games, Political Controversy and Censorship in Latin America. Então eu vou, a partir de agora, falar com o Phillip diretamente e daqui a pouco ele começa a falar. Hi Phillip, good evening. Well, I mean, good evening for me, for you, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, good evening, boa noite. Muito obrigado, Tiago.
Let
You
me
reached the limits of my Portuguese there, but
let me first thank you for agreeing to do this. It's very interesting. It's very important for us to be able to listen to you, to hear you in this talk. This is a theme that is particularly meaningful for us in here because not only it speaks to Latin America, but it speaks to politics that are, well, as we were discussing and we will continue discussing, very alike to what we live in Brazil. So without further ado, I will let you carry on with your talk, and I'll be here if you need me, but the floor is yours. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, Phillip Penix-Tadsen.
great. Thank you again, Tiago, very much for the invitation. It's a real privilege for me to be able to speak with my Brazilian colleagues, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you after the talk and seeing what kind of relationships you pick up between the material I'm discussing and your own experiences in Brazil, especially recently. I'm going to share my screen if I can do that. Let's see. Okay. And I will project. Is that looking okay now? Oops, sorry. I'm sorry. I'm going to share the window instead of my whole screen. Because that was getting kind of meta. Okay, there we go.
Okay.
Metagame Speaker Series in another way. Okay, does that look okay now?
Yeah, super okay.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So thanks again, Thiago. This talk, basically, to give you a heads up of what it's about Mexico, mostly about Venezuela, and also about Cuba, and the response of government officials in each of those countries to controversial video games that were made in the United States and Canada. Specifically, I'm talking about these three video games: Call of Juarez, The Cartel, Mercenaries 2, World at War, and Call of Duty Black Ops. And even more, this talk is about the political commodification of video games, how politicians instrumentalize games in ways that are purportedly in defense of national identity and interests, but are in fact in the name of consolidating political control over their own oppositions. Um, I was talking with Thiago the other day, as he mentioned about he and his co-authors' recent fascinating work about hashtag Todos contra PLS 383 and the Bolsonaro regime's embrace of esports, which in some ways could seem like the opposite of what I'm talking about here, because today in Brazil, of course, a far right-wing regime is embracing games and esports as an opportunity to disseminate their own ideology. Whereas in the cases that I'm looking at of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and Fidel Castro in Cuba, uh, we have left wing regimes who are plotting to ban or censor video games. So they're definitely two different ends of the ideological spectrum. But what these two cases do have in common is the political commodification of video games in the way that politicians use games as a means for disseminating ideology and addressing political issues that are ultimately unrelated to the games themselves. So I think that it's interesting to consider what has happened in the 10 years or so since the cases I'll be talking about this evening, and how the posture of governments like the Bolsonaro regime is different, and also how it is similar to some of the other cases that I'm talking about this evening. To begin with, in talking about banning and censoring video games, this is, of course, nothing new in the United States, in Brazil, or anywhere else. In Brazil, in particular, many of you are probably familiar in 1999, following a shooting rampage that left 3 people dead in a Sao Paulo shopping mall. The Brazilian Justice Ministry banned 6 games, and this is in 1999: Duke Nukem, Doom, Mortal Kombat, Requiem, Blood, and Postal. So all games that were graphically violent and that were banned by the government in response to a violent public criminal act. More recently, in 2019, Vice President Hamilton Mourão condemned violent video games in his response to an attack in which a gunman killed 8 people. And these types of reactions against video games in light of violent crimes are very typical in the United States also. Politicians want to avoid ever criticizing the gun industry in the United States, the weapons industry, or the weapons industry that pays many of these politicians, and rather are quick to condemn video games frequently as being at fault for violent crimes. Just like in Brazil and in the United States, there have been political controversies around games in a number of different circumstances and countries in Latin America, with telling similarities and differences in the legislators' responses to the games in each case. In the case of Mexico, ludic representation, like representation in games, is clearly nothing new, starting with early titles like the 1982 computer game Aztec and the Mask of the Sun, or the 1984 games Montezuma's Revenge and Quest for Quintana Roo. All of these games incorporated the iconography of Maya and Aztec cultures into their digital environments and formulated what would be one of the most enduring tropes of Latin American culture in the realm of electronic games, which is Mexico as an ancient culture, a very constant trope in video games to this day. It probably wasn't until the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis title Urban Strike in 1994 that Mexico was rendered in a video game not as a setting steeped in ancient culture, but as a modern society, even if it was strictly as the backdrop to a military airstrike by helicopter. Urban Strike was the third game in Electronic Arts' helicopter shoot 'em up series, following Desert Strike, Return to the Gulf, and Jungle Strike. And it was set in a then futuristic 2001, 7 years after the release date. The game's Mexico mission, set among the military barracks of an armed fortress in a nearby town, is replete with architecture that both signifies Mexican culture through colonial adobe structures with red tile roofs, and at the same time stands out as an advance in game mechanics since the player can use the helicopter's weapons to destroy the architectural structures in the game. The responsiveness of its environment was what set Urban Strike apart from the earlier titles in the series, and at the same time paved the way for a new Mexican cultural trope in video games, that of the unstable neighbor to the south of the United States in a dystopian, futuristic, military scenario. This representation of Mexico as a setting for military intervention has surged in recent years, occasionally igniting controversy within Mexican politics. The day after the release of this game, Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter 2, Mayor Hector Murguia of Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, asked legislators to block the game's sale, calling it despicable, xenophobic, and harmful to children. Similar controversy arose surrounding the release of Ubisoft's Call of Juarez: The Cartel in 2011, when the state legislature of Chihuahua State unanimously approved a request for the game to be banned nationwide. Now, on one hand, it is of course understandable that local legislators would object to games in which their people are characterized as criminals and cannon fodder more often than not. On the other hand, this is video game exceptionalism in political practice. Video game exceptionalism is game scholar Jesper Yule's term for the way politicians and the mass media frequently depict video games as exceptionally dangerous cultural products, viewing games with a particularly critical or prejudicial eye. Other forms of media, like film, television, and literature, have long depicted the hardships of human existence, including gritty realism ripped from the headlines and news stories of their times. Likewise, there are established traditions in the representation of the drug war in Mexican cultural production, from the narco literatura of writers like Elmer Mendoza to the narco corridos of bands like Los Tigres del Norte or Los Buitres de Sinaloa, to recent films like El Infierno and Saving Private Perez. What is it, then, that makes games like this so particularly notable and so objectionable to politicians in Mexico? Well, I want to talk a little bit about what Call of Juarez: The Cartel is and why it might be found objectionable to politicians in Mexico. Call of Juarez: The Cartel was developed by the Polish firm Techland and published by Ubisoft, the Montreal-based software giant. It is the third game in the series after the original Call of Juarez in 2006 and its prequel Call of Juarez Bound in Blood 2009. Unlike the previous titles in the series and the most recent entry, Call of Juarez Gunslinger, released in 2013, all of which are first-person shooter games set in the Old West, Call of Juarez: The Cartel took on the setting of the contemporary US-Mexico border in the midst of an expanding drug war. So it changed from the Old West setting to this contemporary drug war setting. There is no shortage of evidence in the game to support claims that it is xenophobic. Despite the ostensible focus on the cartel, characters of Mexican origin play only tangential and one-dimensional roles in the game. As the playable team of US authority fights largely on their own country's territory against the encroaching violence of a politically connected cartel, the team members gun down countless Mexican affiliates, all of whom respond with redundant and basic expletive phrases in Spanish. Puta madre, puta, hijo de puta, chinga tu madre, etc. In the game's subtitles, nameless characters are merely referred to as Mexican, like as in the Mexican. And while the playable protagonist, Eddie Guerra, is one of relatively few Latinx protagonists in the history of video games, his cultural depth does not go far beyond his biographical background, growing up in East LA, or the inflection of his dialogue with the occasional ese, or Spanglish phrase such as, "The enemy of my enemy is my carnal." There are, however, elements of contemporary reality in Call of Juarez the Cartel that contribute to a unique portrayal of border geography and culture in the present day, particularly the game's simulation of the militarization of the US Mexico border. Throughout the game, US government officials push for a more frontal military invasion of Mexico, citing increasing threats to national security. Through Fox News like cable reports that play during the cutscenes between missions, we hear the perspective of politicians that inhabit this particular game space. For example, early on, we learned that fictional Attorney General Joseph B. Reynolds is weighing military action in Mexico when he says, quote, "We will seize their drugs, freeze their assets, and hang them high like the outlaws they are. This is war. We have declared war on the Mendoza cartel," end of quote. His perspective is amplified by arch-conservative, again fictional, senatorial candidate Ron Lindsay, who in a Glenn Beck-like bluster calls for the US to go beyond prosecuting criminals in its territory and to actually enact a full-scale military invasion of its southern neighbor. This fictitious militarization has real-world roots. At least as far back as 1999, Claire F. Fox was already referring to the government's stepped-up presentation of the US-Mexico border region as a staging area for war games. In the present day, the US government is using the philosophy of low-intensity wars by patrolling the border with drone aircraft and generating an increased presence along what Fernando Romero Lar has called the hyper border. Romero Lar noted in 2008 that there were more American Border Patrol agents than there were American soldiers in Afghanistan, leaving little doubt as to the reality of border militarization in the first decade of the 21st century, let alone since the rise of Trumpism. Games like Call of Juarez the Cartel create speculative fiction by using these details of actual geopolitical conflicts, harvesting topical poignancy to generate interest in their games. And from its title, The Cartel, to its pre-release announcements, which called the drug cartels the new outlaws and ran the slogan, "Welcome to the new Wild West," it would appear obvious that the marketers of Call of Juarez the Cartel were seeking to raise controversy and public ire and generate some sales in the process. If so, they ultimately succeeded in the former, raising controversy, but failed at the latter, selling copies. It turns out the shift from the Old West to the Mexican contemporary drug war, it grabbed a lot of headlines for the game before it was released. There was a general shock in the media about the fact that 6,000 people had died in Ciudad Juarez in the previous year prior to the game's release due to drug-related violence. And some people were shocked by this. Others celebrated the coming of such controversy, saying, "Bring on the virtual violence. Maybe then we'll pay attention to the real thing." And as I mentioned earlier, Mexican congressional representatives called upon the country's Department of the Interior to ban the game altogether from circulation in Mexico. But despite all of this hubbub and noise about the game, it quickly flailed once it was on the market, racking up an aggregate rating of 45 out of 100 from Metacritic. It ultimately sold around 500,000 copies in an expanding market where successful video games measure their sales in tens of millions of sales. So in this sense, Call of Juarez the Cartel is most of all an example of how the political significance of some games can be disproportionate to their actual social or economic impact. That the political storm that kind of brewed up around Call of Juarez the Cartel was actually of much greater significance than the offensiveness of the game because it reached so few players, so few people played this. Everyone basically recognized that it was no good from the start. In this sense, Mercenaries 2 World in Flames is comparable. While it was a moderately successful release for its publisher, Electronic Arts, it sold just over 2 million copies worldwide. Its impact within the political arena is what came to outweigh its significance as a playable game, particularly with regard to Venezuela. This is due to opposition to this game from one of the most polarizing political figures of the early 21st century, Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, who held office in Venezuela from 1998 until he succumbed to cancer in 2013. Chavez took issue with the representation of Venezuela in Mercenaries 2, and in particular of its socialist leadership in a game designed by California-based Pandemic Studios, who had also developed the previous game Mercenaries Playground of Destruction in 2005. This game, Mercenaries 2, situates the player as a Swedish soldier of fortune named Mattias Nilsson, voiced by the actor Peter Stormare, who some of you may know from Fargo as well as many other movies. This Swedish mercenary is at war in a fictionalized Venezuela, whose government has recently been toppled by a military coup that installs the fictional politician Ramon Solano as the civilian leader of the new government. And this is Solano, the rogue Venezuelan leader in the game here. Solano pontificates on the need to nationalize the nation's petroleum while in reality pursuing his own economic gains, sparking violent conflicts between different sectors within the game, including a CIA-funded mercenary force, the private security agency of Universal Petroleum, which is the foreign-owned company looking to maintain its stake in Venezuela's oil in spite of the coup in the game, and finally the guerrilla organization known as the People's Liberation Army of Venezuela. These factions do battle in what is doubtlessly the most thorough rendering of Venezuela's geography in video game form to date, including the cities of Caracas, Maracaibo, Mérida, Cumaná, and Guanare, as well as the areas of Amazonas and Isla Margarita, and several unspecified locales in the Venezuelan countryside. In terms of its tone, overall, the game is reminiscent of a satirical and ironic comic book in which nothing is taken too seriously. Political metaphors are mixed without any consistent narrative thread that would indicate a sustained commentary on real world affairs. However, little time passed before this game, despite a relative lack of success in terms of sales and critical reception, would produce major effects in the real world. Sensing critical overtones in the game's depiction of national politics, members of Chavez's Patria para Todos (PPT) party began to denounce the game publicly as a threat to national security, characterizing its designers as, quote, doing the work of Washington in order to drum up support from Americans for an eventual operation to overthrow Chavez. Before long, President Chavez himself took up the subject, offering his evaluation of the game on his weekly A lo Presidente television program. And I'll play a short excerpt. It's in Spanish. The important part is translated in English in the quote here. This is from Chavez's television program, A lo Presidente.
I don't think it's playing, Philip.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I'm sorry the video didn't play. Thank you, Thiago, for letting me know. So he was denouncing the PlayStation as poisonous, denouncing video games using PlayStation as a euphemism for video games. So Chavez in this program says, "What about those games that they call PlayStation? Poison. There are even killing games that teach you to kill. They even made one with my own face once. Yes, that's right. You had to kill Chavez, hunt down Chavez and kill him. They bomb cities, they drop bombs. A PlayStation. What's that? You know? Ah, it's capitalism. Planting seeds of violence so that later they can sell us weapons." Okay, so this is the quote, the denunciation. And Chavez's characterization of the game's plot was widely accepted and used as evidence by politicians and journalists alike, although in reality, Chavez is never mentioned in Mercenaries 2. So when he says they made one with his face, you had to hunt Chavez, he's talking about Mercenaries 2, but as you see, it's not Chavez's face, and he is in fact never mentioned in this game. This didn't stop legislators from condemning video games at large as teaching children to be violent, and before long they found success in their political maneuvering, approving in December 2009 new legislation titled The Law for the Prohibition of Bellicose Video Games and Bellicose Toys, which makes it a legal requirement for each and every video game sold in Venezuela to, quote, promote respect for life, creativity, healthy entertainment, partnership, loyalty, teamwork, respect for the law, learning, tolerance, understanding among people, and the spirit of peace and brotherhood. And if anyone knows any video game that could possibly live up to these standards, then I invite you to let me know. It's very difficult to imagine any video game being capable of doing all of these things. And in fact, that's by design. This law was made to be so general and so broad that no game could possibly comply with these requirements, and that therefore this law can be applied arbitrarily against Chavez and his party's political enemies at will. So in addition to these requirements, the law assigns fines of more than 100,000 US dollars and mandates a 3 to 5 year prison sentence to any individual importing, manufacturing, selling, or renting such games. Moreover, Article 8, destruction, stipulates that the Venezuelan government is responsible for destroying the offending materials, a task that was then carried out as a public spectacle by operatives that literally steamrolled controversial toys and video games, as seen in this image from the news source in Venezuela. And within a short time, that Venezuelan model was duplicated elsewhere. Panama passed its own law prohibiting bellicose or violent games and toys in 2011, and Chile drafted legislation placing legal restrictions on the circulation of violent games in 2014. In the meantime, Venezuelan game designers complain that the law has crippled the national industry at a time when many other Latin American administrations are looking to enhance and build their country's game production. By politically distorting the dimensions of a game that one Venezuelan writer has ironically labeled the most controversial video game that no one ever played, all while characterizing the game's intended audience as juvenile and its political implications as transparent. By doing all of this, Chavez and his supporters succeeded in legislating far-reaching censorship that eliminates creative freedoms in the country under the guise of confronting imperialist capitalism. And indeed, this law has been applied as expected, used to punish political opponents like 35-year-old web developer Leonardo Quintero, whose mugshot is seen here, who was imprisoned for 1 month under the law in 2017 for having created the politically themed web game Chavista Attack that same year. After being conditionally released, Quintero was required to remove the game from circulation. These were the effects, the political effects of Mercenaries 2 and its depiction of Venezuela. So how did Mercenaries 2 really depict Venezuela? So to start with, I want to say this was not the first, nor is it likely to be the last representation of Venezuela in video game form. And in fact, over the course of the early 2000s, the fictionalized representation of Chavez's Venezuela was practically a trope, a leitmotif among military games. For example, the plot of Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six 3 revolves around a covert operation by the US government to assassinate the fictitious Venezuelan president Juan Crespo after he attempts to create an international oil crisis and benefit from it by jacking up prices to the United States. For its part, the futuristic tactical role-playing game Front Mission 4, set in 2096, involves an allied international invasion of Venezuela after its rogue leader breaks away from the international diplomatic organization known as the United States of the New Continent. Just 6 months before the release of the controversial Mercenaries 2 came Conflict Denied Ops, which revolves around a CIA operation to take out the fictional regime of General Ramirez, a petroleum nationalizing rogue leader seeking to take control of the country after internal divisions have left it polarized and embattled. To greater or lesser extremes, all of these games create a fictional rendering of certain tendencies of the Chavez administration, as well as the interventionist pretensions of the United States. So why did Mercenaries 2 garner special attention from the regime? Like other military-themed games discussed in this chapter, in this talk, Mercenaries 2 attempts to create a sense of realism by including references to real-world political circumstances, even though it's through the lens of fictionalization and parody. Pandemic Studios in California, the creators of the game, have stated that they always want to have a rip from the headlines, and that they focus specifically on geopolitical situations where, quote, a conflict doesn't necessarily have to be happening, but it's realistic enough to believe it could eventually happen, end of quote. Matthew Colville, the lead writer for Mercenaries 2, explains in an interview with Venezuelan journalist Gregory David Escobar that when the design team heard of the denunciations of the game as imperialist propaganda, quote, we never thought anyone in Venezuela could take that seriously, end of quote, asserting that the decision to set the game in Venezuela was made for creative and artistic reasons. There are elements of this fictitious environment that seem to match up with real-life Venezuela under Chavez. For example, Solano is a vociferous leader who seeks to use Venezuela's oil reserves as the basis for making the country into a South American superpower, much like Chavez's own pretensions of making Venezuela the leader of a socialist bloc in Latin America. Pro-Solano pedestrians in this game shout out sentences like "Viva Solano! He is Bolivar reborn," referencing not only the enduring legacy of Venezuelan national hero Simón Bolívar, but also Chávez's self-fashioning as the leader of a new movement that took the liberator's name, his Bolivarian Revolution. So on the one hand, there are these similarities. You can't deny it's definitely a depiction of Chavez and his regime. On the other hand, the game is clearly a parody, with a tone closer to a Hollywood action movie than a realist documentary. Indeed, for anyone who may have played Mercenaries 2, it is difficult to imagine the game being seriously characterized as, quote, a justification of imperialist aggression, end of quote, much less part of a, quote, campaign of psychological terror, end of quote, which are the words of two different Venezuelan congressional representatives. That's hard to swallow. It would be much easier, in fact, to substantiate the opposite reading, that the game is not an endorsement, but a critique of US interventionism. For one thing, the player of Mercenaries 2 is not, in fact, playing a game of US intervention. On the contrary, as the title indicates, the protagonist belongs to a force of mercenaries, hired guns, who, among whom not one of them is from the US. Nielsen, the leader, is Swedish, his main radio dispatcher is Australian, the helicopter pilot Ewan is Irish, the mechanic Eva Navarro is Venezuelan, and the jet pilot is an inebriated Russian. The player fights for all fictitious sides in this struggle as well. The first missions support Universal Petroleum, but they quickly give way to jobs for the People's Liberation Army of Venezuela and other factions. There are also numerous indications of the game's critical stance toward the neo-imperialist efforts of the international governments and corporations involved in the game's plot. First, there's the actual written information that's provided to the player. For example, Universal Petroleum, the game's version of a Texas-based multinational oil giant, is described as having, quote, made a deal with the Venezuelan government 50 years ago. In the decades since, UP made billions of dollars from the arrangement, end of quote. If this wasn't plain enough, late in the story, the CEO of Universal Petroleum directly tells the player, as the mercenary Nielsen, that the company, quote, has been screwing the Venezuelans out of their oil, end of quote. In other words, US imperialism, corporate greed, and disrespect for Venezuela are not the hidden truths of Mercenaries 2, but rather the superficially evident elements of its parodic framework. However, nobody in the Chavez administration seemed particularly interested in examining how Mercenaries 2 worked on a ludic level. It was more politically efficacious to use the game in other ways. But when Chavez denounced the game for devaluing Venezuelan lives, he failed to note that Mercenaries 2 does, in fact, place a value on those lives. They're worth $5,000 apiece. Now, at first blush, this reduction of a human life to a monetary value might seem absurd as well as dehumanizing. But understood within a ludic system of logic, this $5,000 per life price tag actually has a profound functional impact on the meaning of human life in the game. To comprehend this, we must take into account that Mercenaries 2 is essentially a skinned version of the open world genre defined by the Grand Theft Auto series. It's basically a skinned version of Grand Theft Auto. This means that Mercenaries 2 and GTA not only share their genre and basic scenario, both of these games are open world, third person shooters in which the player can hijack vehicles and take on missions to make money, but they also share their fundamental game mechanics, including the manner in which missions are presented to the player as multiple tangentially interrelated options within an expansive and responsive world, and elements such as the health meter, physical damage to vehicles, and the transportation physics. So, given that Mercenaries 2 comes from the genre that's defined by Grand Theft Auto, there's an important ludic difference in Mercenaries 2 that Chavez did not take into account. In the GTA games, players receive no penalty for running down or shooting and killing pedestrians unless they are caught by the police doing so. On the contrary, most of their victims in Grand Theft Auto will leave behind some money to award their aggression, meaning that non player character, NPC murder, is a profitable enterprise in GTA. In Mercenaries 2, on the other hand, protection of the population is incentivized early on when rebel leader Marcela Acosta offers, quote, a big bonus not to injure any civilians, end of quote, after which the player is fined $5,000 for each civilian casualty incurred. By imposing this significant monetary penalty on players who show wanton disregard for the lives of the game's NPCs, Mercenaries 2 actually forces the player to veer from the norm for this genre and into a less sociopathic form of gameplay by design. From a game literate perspective, then, Venezuelan lives are actually worth much more in Mercenaries 2 than a veteran player might expect. This is one of many indications that what games mean for political discourse is frequently quite the opposite of what they mean for their players. Now, Chavez was by no means the only national leader in Latin America to take on the video game industry in recent years. Former Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega, who remains in Panamanian prison for human rights violations, attracted headlines when he sued Activision, the publisher of the 2012 game Call of Duty Black Ops 2, alleging that they had illegally used his image and likeness in a defamatory manner. Although Noriega's case was dismissed, it is evidence of the increasing relevance and immediacy of video games for players and for politicians alike. Noriega's case, which dealt with a Latin American head of state that was also a known political enemy of the US, suing the publishers of Call of Duty, had echoes of another major political controversy, this one surrounding the depiction of Cuban leader Fidel Castro in Activision's 2010 release, Call of Duty Black Ops. Like so many geopolitical hotspots, Cuba has a relatively lengthy history of representation in video games. Prior to its appearance in Call of Duty Black Ops, the era of the Cuban Revolution had served as the backdrop of games beginning with the arcade action shooter Guerrilla War by SNK in Japan in 1987, whose original Japanese title was Guevara, and this game was originally titled Guevara, and it followed the exploits of Ernesto Che Guevara and the forces of the Cuban Revolution as they proceeded to overthrow Batista. For the North American release of this Japanese title, the title was changed, the dictator and island setting were made generic, and the protagonist, Guevara, was swapped for a US soldier. It's just an interesting case of the ways that games are politically and culturally localized, as well as being localized in other manners. The Cuban Revolution also provided the setting for games such as the real-time strategy PC simulation Cuban Missile Crisis: The Aftermath, and the open-world action-adventure adaptation The Godfather 2. Post-revolutionary Cuba is also a favored setting for games portraying U.S. interventions, international intrusions, and criminal activity, including Flight Simulator A-10 Cuba, the Nintendo 64 James Bond adaptation GoldenEye 007, real-time strategy titles Command and Conquer, Red Alert 2 and 3, action driving game Driver 2, Back on the Streets, the Island Thunder expansion pack for the tactical shooter Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon, and the PC real-time strategy game Act of War, High Treason. Along with ancient Mexico, the Spanish colonies, the Brazilian favela, and the Amazon jungle, revolutionary and post-revolutionary Cuba is one of the most frequent tropes of Latin American culture in video games. And I'm drawing toward the close of the final section here, and I'm just a few more minutes. So what was it that made Black Ops unique? Well, for one thing, unlike some of the controversial games that I've discussed earlier in this talk, Black Ops was a widely played international success. While Call of Juarez the Cartel sold around 500,000 copies and Mercenaries 2 topped out at just over 2 million, Call of Duty Black Ops set a new global record for the most successful release of any media product in history and has sold more than 30 million copies worldwide to date. Noting the game's broad dissemination and appeal, the Cuban government interpreted Black Ops as an attack on national sovereignty, declaring on the state website Cuba Debate that, quote, what the US government was unable to achieve for more than 50 years, it is now trying to reach through virtual means, end of quote, by requiring players to assassinate Fidel Castro in a game that is, quote, without a doubt, entertainment for psychopaths, end of quote. The Cuban government does not mince words about its position on this game. While questioning the bounds, the mental stability of the millions of global players of Black Ops might overstep the bounds of logic, in this case, the government gets the facts right, at least in part. The objective of the very first mission in this game is indeed to find and kill Castro, an operation that the player attempts to carry out against the backdrop of the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion. In the game, the player, as a soldier named Woods, alongside his partner Mason, enter the final rooms of the Castro compound. A Matrix like slow motion bullet time effect kicks in, a handful of final soldiers are killed, and the US infantry proceeds into the final bedroom, with Woods asking, ready to make history? Here, Fidel Castro is located with a scantily clad female companion. He uses her as a human shield, but Mason fires a single bullet, which spurs an angel's singing effect and more slow motion capture for a gruesome and graphic close up of Castro apparently getting assassinated by a bullet through the head. Woods, and thus the player, goes on to realize that this was a setup, that Castro knew of the plan and the individual assassinated was actually a stand in. And we see the real Fidel handing the agent over to a military officer, saying, in English, do with him what you wish, General. He is my gift to you in honor of our new relationship. Just make sure that he suffers. This cues cutscene footage of the real life Fidel Castro and Nikita Khrushchev, and newsreel footage of a summit between Cuba and the Soviet Union as Mason is taken to a Soviet internment camp. This is the basic thrust of the Black Ops storyline regarding the Cuban government. However, Cuban culture is in fact much more richly represented in ludic terms than in this narrative reduction. This is because at least as many players spend their time playing Call of Duty online multiplayer as they do playing the offline story mode. Excuse me. This is significant because 4 of the 14 multiplayer maps in Black Ops are located in Cuba, meaning that more than 25% of the time that players spend in the game is time spent in a virtual Cuba. There's also a playable Cuban military faction known as Tropas, and a force of Cuban military contractors known as Op 40, all of whom speak an untranslated Spanish in the game, with phrases like tirando granada, explosivo fuera, cambiando cargador, muerto confirmado, el blanco cayó, etc. Many of these phrases are divided into interchangeable groups. For example, cayó el enemigo and muerto confirmado both confirm an enemy fatality. If the player watches the replay of their own death immediately following their demise, the character killing them will not repeat the same phrase they said originally, but rather the next phrase in line for that function. So the portrayal of Cuban culture in Black Ops pertains to the particularities of Call of Duty as a semiotic system, including linguistic as well as audiovisual signs. And these signs lead the player to reach several conclusions regarding Cuban culture. Number one, Cuba is a revolutionary state. These are the messages taught about Cuba in this game. Number one, Cuba is a revolutionary state. Two, prior to the revolution, Cuba was a decadent tourist playground. Number three, Cuba was central to the Cold War confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. And finally, number four, Cuba is defined by its tropical ecology, topography, and cultural production. Now, each of these messages provides potentially meaningful insights into Cuba's history and identity. However, the Cuban government did not account for procedural and semiotic representations of culture in its condemnation of Black Ops, according to what were essentially narrative criteria. And now I conclude final minute here. It is certainly understandable that games portraying the attempted assassination of Cuba's real-life leadership, requiring the overthrow of a fictionalized Venezuelan socialist leader, or trivializing the very real violence sweeping across Mexico today, would raise the ire of politicians in these respective nations. Ethics do not disappear altogether within the game world, although they are contextualized differently. As Miguel Sicart asserts in his book The Ethics of Computer Games, quote, emptying games of ethical reflection in their design and using unethical content for its shock value as a marketing resource means not only devaluing the possibilities of games as a means of expression, but also making products that are unethical objects, end of quote. Some of the content in the games at the heart of the political controversies discussed in this talk is indeed ethically questionable, though it is important to remember that just how exactly ethics operate in these games is very much a question rather than a foregone and transparent conclusion. The simplifications and distortions required to condemn these games in the press and to pass legislation censoring them show how video games are commodified in the political sphere, being utilized for ideological saber rattling rather than understood as unique cultural products with their own systems of signification. And this is perhaps why the 2013 game Gesta Final, the final game I'll mention here, Final Feat, published by Cuba's Youth Computation and Electronics Club, a computer science initiative supported by the National Ministry of Communications, is so groundbreaking. In Gesta Final, this game, Final Feat, the player embodies one of several unnamed bearded revolutionaries, and according to the club's leadership, allows them to identify with the history of the Cuban Revolution. Players of the first-person shooter act as members of the 82-soldier contingent that disembarked from the yacht Granma and whose surviving members ultimately defeated the regime of dictator Fulgencio Batista, passing through 5 major in-game battles along the way. The club's spokesperson, Eileen Corujo, clarifies that this game was not designed as a direct response to the controversy stirred up surrounding Black Ops' portrayal of Cuba, and explains, we aren't responding to any other game. What's important for us is for young people to learn while playing. End of quote. Regardless, Gesta Final represents a truly novel approach. Instead of simply rejecting games as the tools of capitalism that use violence to poison the minds of the youth, as did Hugo Chavez, the government supported the development of a violent video game that also happens to teach the values of the Cuban Revolution. In other words, rather than condemn or attempt to ban video games based on their violence or alleged imperialist bias, the makers of Final Feat sought to produce the type of game that they think should be played about the Cuban Revolution. This final example reveals the potential for Latin American game developers to take control of the ludic message on their own cultures and national histories. Controversies surrounding video games continue to be politically productive, and therefore their reductive but persuasive use by public figures is bound to continue. But meanwhile, today's game designers, critics, and players are looking beyond this trivializing realm of political posturing and poisonous PlayStations and using games not only for entertainment, but as a means of confronting ideological issues through gameplay. Thank you.
Fantastic, Philip. Thank you so much for your presentation. I have so many things to actually comment, but I'll start with the chat interaction. I think it's interesting if we gather the questions of the chat. So I think Ivan already has some of them lined up.
Yes. So, Philip, I will read the question in Portuguese, and then I can translate to you, or you can read it in the screen.
Okay, I'm just seeing the chat for the first time. I'm sorry. It's great
Yeah.
that there was so much discussion when I was in my presentation.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
So, the first question is from Daniel Marques. Vou falar aqui a pergunta em português, né? O Daniel pergunta como que os jogadores mexicanos e venezuelanos lidam ou negociam com esses tipos de representação. Isso é uma questão crítica para eles. So, Philip Would you like to answer it?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the question, Daniel. I think that there are players who see this kind of from two different perspectives. I think the most common thing is to see this representation of their culture as a joke, as a horrible, inaccurate, stereotypical representation of Mexico as the land of drug war, the land of danger. Likewise, in the game about Venezuela. So I think that people in Mexico and in Venezuela, just like players in Brazil, are accustomed to playing these fictionalized versions of their country that are very stereotypical frequently and that do not correspond to the reality that those players know in their own countries, much less to the cultural depth and diversity of the countries in questions. On the other hand, I occasionally will hear from players who are really gratified that there is so much of a Mexican setting in some of the games, like Call of Juarez, the Cartel, or that they could have made another Old West game, but they decided to make one that's really set in the U.S. Mexican border and that takes on some contemporary political issues that are actually relevant. So I do occasionally see people, responding positively that at least there is representation of Venezuela or of Cuba or of Mexico in global video games, but without a doubt, you have to recognize that that representation is problematic.
Okay, thank you a lot, Philip. We can go to another chat question. Pessoal, quem quiser fazer perguntas, tiver pergunta para o Philip, pode ir colocando no chat que a gente vai fazendo em ordem. Eu vou...
Ivan,
sim.
Não, eu acho uma boa, Philip, excuse me, eu acho uma boa a gente traduzir um pouco também para o pessoal da resposta dele e tal. I'm telling Ivan, I think we should try to translate your answers so the people in the chat, the people who doesn't actually speak English can participate in the debate.
Yes, that's great, please.
Resumindo assim a última resposta do Philip, né, que foi sobre essa questão de como os jogadores lidam, né, e interpretam as suas representações dos seus lugares de origem, né, nos jogos, ele deu uma resposta assim, colocando que é uma questão ambígua, né, que por um lado ele citou vários jogos aí que a representação em si não era por si só uma crítica, por exemplo, aos regimes latino-americanos, porém, politicamente, eles adquiriam um significado político crítico, né? Eram usados politicamente com essa crítica. Eu acho que a raiz do problema, que é aonde a fala dele chega no final, é a falta dos próprios latino-americanos exporem, né, as suas representações dos seus lugares de origem, né? Então, acho que é mais ou menos isso. O Philip fala que existe essa necessidade dos jogadores de se verem representados e de, ao mesmo tempo, uma falta de matéria-prima para a gente utilizar essas representações a nosso favor, né? Desculpa se eu não traduzi bem, né? Porque eu não estava preparado.
Sounds good to me, Ivan, and I know how difficult it is to do live interpretation. I've been there myself, so I understand.
Yeah, thank you a lot. Então, a próxima pergunta, the next question from Don Charlin, I think it's Carlos. So it's, I'm gonna read it in Portuguese for people in the chat. Além de personagens nazistas, você acha que vilões latino-americanos podem soar como uma figura inimiga mais fácil, né, do que, por exemplo, figuras chinesas, coreanas ou árabes, né, principalmente porque a América Latina não é um alvo, ou melhor, uma ameaça militar tão grave quanto esses outros países, né, e também por uma questão de possíveis repercussões de baixas vendas na China, né, que é um mercado muito importante.
Excelente questão.
Ótimo.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think it's that mentioning the example of Nazi characters is the typical kind of enemy of video games. There's so many military games that are based in World War II or that are a fictionalization of the battle against Nazis. That the Nazi is the easiest character, the target of the player's hatred and anger and violence, and that's been the kind of easy go-to stereotype for game developers for a long time. In terms of why the Latin American villains, I mean, I think it has to do with some of the popular mythology, particularly surrounding the drug war. Um, in most of these, well, in a lot of these games, it's about U.S. intervention or the CIA fighting against drug cartels. And of course, that's a popular narrative, not just in video games, but in television. And since these games came out, Narcos and Narcos Mexico have become huge series for Netflix. And there are, endless examples also from Brazil, the Secret Agent Force One, the series that was on television, right? There are all of these different examples of this kind of military intervention mythology set in major locales in Latin America, Mexico and Colombia, but also Brazil. And I think that they are kind of part of the zeitgeist. They're part of what the messages that we hear globally, and that again, these are things ripped from the headlines. That these are just things geopolitical hot spots is the words that some of the game developers used. That knowing that Venezuela has been a center of crisis and conflict in the entirety of the 21st century so far, that's made it an attractive place for game developers to represent. And ultimately, I think that the Latin American enemy is not as common as an Arabian or Muslim terrorist enemy in video games since 2001 in particular. That has truly become the new Nazi for many game developers. However, I think that there's a similar kind of racism, xenophobia, dehumanization of the other at work in these Latin American villains, as well as the others that you mentioned.
Bom, então resumindo um pouquinho a resposta do Philip, é que ele falou que realmente existe uma espécie de espírito de narrativo, né? É uma espécie de clichê narrativo, você recorrer à questão da intervenção militar dos Estados Unidos na América Latina, né? Então existe essa, além de, claro, ser um alvo mais fácil, porque na China, por exemplo, você tem um mercado consumidor muito grande, né? Talvez um dos principais, mas também tem essa questão que ele ressalta de ser uma espécie de recurso narrativo muito comum, né? Não só nos videogames, mas na série televisiva, na Hollywood, etc., né? Então tem essa questão, né? E que também ele ressalta essa parte da desumanização do outro, né? Essa transformação do vilão em outro a partir da sua nacionalidade, e que tem isso, que isso acontece também, principalmente depois do 11 de setembro, com personagens de origem árabe, né, e de países do Oriente Médio.
Yes. I have some things to comment actually, because I believe you were referring to Tropa de Elite, maybe,
Yeah.
which is well, the chat is actually discussing this movie Tropa de Elite, and it's really interesting how these things go along each other, because when you were talking about let me grab the name of the game, the game about the cartel. I was actually thinking about a map in Counter-Strike. It was the map that put Brazil in the map of esports. It's called CS Rio, which is a map that was made by these two Brazilians, two guys from São Paulo, and the map, from São Paulo, ironically, because the map is in Rio, and the map it pictures a favela, and it has all the stereotypes of the favela, the slums, the soccer in the barren field, the samba, the music, yeah, the samba. So it's yeah. So it's at the same time it is. I don't mean that specifically, but at the same time it had some accuracy. It is dangerously stereotypical because it frames the favela and it well, I think the other maps in CS were impersonal maybe, but this one seemed real personal because we have this big narrative in Brazil that puts the bad guys in the top of the favelas, which are our drug lords, and the good guys in the bottom or at the level of the sea, which are our policemen. And Tropa de Elite discusses precisely this. So I think, well, it's more of a commentary, but I think it's really something we have to try to analyze about this type of media, because and I like that you brought Sicart's discussion on ethics of computer games, because they are, and I'm not getting to the material thing about the game design. We will get to that, but I'm getting on the representation and we have to watch how this type of media is being made, because it actually, I don't know what's the word, but it frames people in a terrible way. It diminishes them. I think it's that. So at the same time, it is a success. CS Rio was the most played map in Brazil, so people, they engage on that media without even realizing what they're doing. So how do we fight this, Philip? How do we go for the ethical choice?
I think that, in thinking about as gamers, as players, as well as the game development community, the optimistic answer for me is by making better games that are more profound and more complex and do a better job and do more justice to the cultural environments that they are representing. I see a lot of hope out of Latin American game developers, designing games made about their own national histories, made about their own national cultures in ways that can go beyond these very stereotypical depictions that we usually see from the global media industry. And I see more and more of that. Of course, game development is flourishing throughout Latin America, and while that doesn't universally mean that game developers are always representing their own national or regional or local culture, nevertheless, those opportunities are expanding, and we're seeing many more developers from Brazil, from Mexico, from Chile, from Argentina, from Uruguay, taking on topics of national relevance and making games that would never be made in the United States or in Canada or in Western Europe. I'm thinking about games like educational games about Uruguay's independence movement, or games about environmentalism in the Amazon, that frequently will come from local developers, but the global game industry is never going to take an interest or kind of show that level of diversity in their products. So that's, for me, is the big hope, is honestly that we will focus more and more attention on game developers who are representing the depth and diversity of their national cultures in the face of these very stereotypical representations that dominate the market.
Deixa eu tentar traduzir então, pessoal. Enfim, dentro dessa coisa do que estava sendo discutido antes, eu falei um pouco sobre como Tropa de Elite oferece uma percepção do morro como um lugar completamente, né, dividido entre os favelados, que são do mal, e os contra-terroristas, a polícia, que são do bem, e como isso está representado muito fortemente em CS Rio, né? E eu perguntei como é que a gente sai desses problemas éticos de ter que apelar para essas representações maniqueístas. E ele falou mais ou menos, e aí eu vou tentar, né? Me perdoem pela imprecisão, mas ele falou mais ou menos que a gente vê vários desenvolvedores que são de locais específicos, Chile, Brasil, Argentina, Uruguai, etc., e que esses desenvolvedores eles estão fazendo coisas diferentes e trazendo, oferecendo essa diversidade na cultura dos videogames, e que a gente precisa olhar para essa diversidade de alguma forma. But I have a follow-up question that I would like to make before we get back to the chat. There's plenty of conversation going on, so I'll try to focus on that. Ivan, por favor, já seleciona as coisas aí. But I have a follow-up question, which is... Okay, I agree with you. The developers, they are getting there. I think the industry has been showing, even in the AAA section, let's call it that. Even in the AAA section, there's this necessity, this need for diversity. So it's happening. It's actually happening. But I would like to focus on the players. And why do I ask that? I ask that because we in here, you read our piece, né? our paper, and it kinda shows how the gamers do respond to these types of content. So it's true, the developers, they are committed to diversity, but I don't think the gamers are committed to diversity. How do we, as game scholars, how do we tackle that? Because there's a bit of a joke, but a bit of truth that I used to make when we're on live presentings. I say the game scholars are the enemies of the gamer culture. You don't have to go very far to notice that. See, just look at how Gamergate spread through Digra's network, and how it took a toll from people like Tori Mortensen, for example, and some other women in the mailing list. So how do we as game scholar tackle that problem in the gamer culture?
It's a huge and enormously important question, Tiago, I think, and it's one of the most significant problems that I think we face as a community of players and academics and game developers. The toxicity of the gaming community is overwhelming, and I think that we have to confront it directly. As scholars, I think we have to confront it by writing about these things and taking them on directly, and talking about why diversity of representation is important, but also going beyond representation to talk about the ways that identity factors, from your gender to your sexual orientation to your race to your nationality, affect the opportunities that you have as a player and as a game developer. And I think really starting to understand the impact of diversity beyond just representation, as well as the impact of toxicity and exclusionism beyond just the toxicity of in-game chat and people being verbally abusive with one another, understanding the ways that that toxicity actually expands much beyond that, to make it harder for people of color or for women to work in the video game industry, for example, that results in exclusion of massive segments of the population because of toxic work environments, because of toxic traditions and practices in the game industry. So it's a multi-leveled response, but I feel like the simple answer is to not let those toxic forces dominate the discourse, that we have to provide a counter discourse, and a counter discourse that directly engages with that toxic narrative that can be so dominant. That sounds very simple when I say it, but it's something that I feel we will be struggling with forever with games and gaming.
It is actually excellent that you say that, because we have in the chat some people that are not necessarily scholars. They are streamers. They are content creators on video games, and that's exactly what they need to hear. Então, eu perguntei para ele, tipo assim, bom, fora daquela discussão sobre representação, como é que a gente segue para ser game scholars, ou seja, pesquisadores de videogame, e dar conta de lidar com uma cultura que é extremamente tóxica e problemática, e que é, em muitas dimensões, nossa inimiga, né? Porque nós, no geral, temos posições progressistas, né? Enquanto a cultura gamer é reconhecida, e a gente tem vários exemplos de reacionarismo, né? De uma cultura particularmente reacionária. E aí o que ele disse é o seguinte, e aí eu vou condensar a resposta também, mas assim, a última parte da resposta, o que ele disse é que a gente precisa dominar a narrativa, a gente precisa produzir conteúdo para dominar essa narrativa e sufocar de alguma forma esse tipo de ação, de atitude dentro da cultura gamer, porque e aí esses problemas, eles não acontecem, eles vão além. Ele botou isso e eu acho assim particularmente interessante. Eles vão além, e é uma coisa que a gente tem discutido nas lives, nas nossas lives também, né? Eles vão além da toxicidade no chat e nas representações. Eles aparecem em como as mulheres, por exemplo, são impedidas de trabalhar na indústria, de como existe racismo e xenofobia dentro da indústria, entre desenvolvedores, e a gente precisa combater não um nível, mas multiníveis nos quais isso está acontecendo. Então, excellent response, Philip. Thank you so much. Ivan.
Okay, I will translate this nice question by Kenneth. So, if you want to read it, Philip. Bom, o Kenneth pergunta sobre um jogo chamado Total Overdose, que tem todas as características que o Philip descreve, né, dos estereótipos de pessoas mexicanas, as questões narrativas de explosão, invasão de exército e etc., de morte, mas que tem um protagonista mexicano. E o Kenneth pergunta até que ponto isso muda algo na representação ideológica do jogo.
Very good question. Thank you very much for the question. I have not personally played Total Overdose, but I think that I would relate it in some ways to Call of Juarez, the Cartel, or the game Just Cause, which I saw some people have mentioned in the chat as well. Just Cause and Just Cause 2 also have Latin protagonists, or one of the members of the police force in Call of Juarez, the Cartel, is Latino, is Mexican American. Personally, yeah, I think that those are probably just as racist representations as, you know, a game that had pure American, US American characters fighting against Mexicans. I feel like there's a kind of tokenism, an attempt to use diversity in the game in a tokenistic way, but that does not really translate into any profound changes within the game. I see that Total Overdose is from a Danish developer. So without knowing much about its development context, I'm assuming that much like these games produced in the United States and Canada, they're not made with an intimate knowledge of Mexican culture, but rather are just made based on what stereotypes are at hand. So I think that, and someone else asked in the chat if Mexican game developers or Colombian game developers tend to represent their own people in the same stereotypical way that we see in global media. And I would say frequently, yes, absolutely, that people are influenced by these stereotypical and racist views of their national culture within countries as well as elsewhere. And especially for game developers who are trying to make something that's kind of an easily recognizable Mexican setting or Brazilian setting, I think it's still very common for developers in those places to lean on and rely on those stereotypes in the games that they put out. The exception, the really exceptional thing, is when you see generally an independent developer who has done something different that's not stereotypical. I think about a game like Mulaka. Mulaka is a Mexican game that's set in the Tarahumara indigenous culture of northern Mexico and is designed to kind of bring the mythology of that indigenous culture to players outside of Mexico as well as in Mexico. Or another example is the game Papo y Yo, which is from a Colombian designer, Vander Caballero, and it's actually set in a favela type environment, but it's done in a very atypical way. It's an environmental puzzling game. There's no violence, there's no weapons in the game, and the favela is kind of a comforting space to create relationships in this game. So those examples like Mulaka and Papo y Yo, those are very rare, exceptional examples I see of people going beyond stereotypes and representing something a little deeper about their own culture.
Bom, o Philip falou sobre a pergunta do Kenneth, né, sobre o Total Overdose, que ele não jogou o jogo, mas que ele compararia inicialmente com o Call of Juarez, né, que tem questões de representação ali, com alguma significância assim, pro México, mas que acaba caindo na questão do tokenismo, né, de você usar o protagonista, no caso do Total Overdose, provavelmente, né, como uma espécie de desculpa para você poder dizer que o seu jogo tem uma representatividade de um latino-americano e, portanto, ele não é problemático, né? É uma espécie de arma retórica ali para o seu jogo não ser criticado, mesmo ele tendo todos os outros problemas que a gente vê nos jogos, nos demais jogos, Call of Duty, por aí vai, né? Aí ele fala também que é feito por uma companhia dinamarquesa, o que já indica para a gente que existe aí algum problema de representação, né, provavelmente. Então não tem uma profundo conhecimento sobre a experiência de ser latino-americano na feitura desse jogo, né? E falou também, respondendo uma outra pergunta do chat, né, sobre essa questão do estereótipo, falou que é muito comum a gente ainda ver esses estereótipos justamente por uma questão, além do preconceito, também de uma questão de facilidade, de quando você representa essas coisas, você consegue comunicar uma ideia de forma mais rápida e meio preguiçosa, né, mas mais rápida para o público, né? Justamente porque a gente já está muito acostumado a ver o México, por exemplo, ser representado de uma determinada maneira, né? A gente tem até a piada no cinema que no México geralmente é quando a paisagem fica amarela, né? O céu fica amarelo, porque significa que você chegou no México. E ele ressalta que existem exemplos, né, de combate a esse tipo de representação. Ele cita 2 jogos, um é o Papo y Yo, que eu conheço, o outro eu confesso que eu não... I didn't hear the other games. Mulaka, ok.
Uhum.
Então ele fala desses 2 exemplos que são exemplos de representação que quebram e que dão um indício que existe possibilidade de você quebrar com esse estereótipo e ainda assim representar esses lugares de maneira menos problemática, né? Posso ir para outra pergunta?
Sim, acho que sim. Vamos nessa.
Ok, Philip, I will read another question. Pergunta do Alexander Carneiro, tomara que ele esteja aí ainda, porque é uma muito boa pergunta também. Ele vai perguntar, deixa eu colocar aqui na tela. No Call of Duty Modern Warfare, os jogadores lidam com uma organização terrorista chamada Al-Qatala, e o jogo é muito realista, né? Tem essa estética pretensamente realista. Os desenvolvedores dizem que o seu jogo não é político, né? Por que você acha que eles não veem o próprio jogo como político, e se existe alguma chance dos desenvolvedores de abraçarem, né, de adotarem um texto político, uma mensagem política a partir dos seus jogos?
Yes, I appreciate the question. Thank you. I think that absolutely the implication here is clear that that Call of Duty Modern Warfare is taking on geopolitics, that they are representing Al Qaeda when they represent Al Qatala, and represent the kind of geopolitical phenomena that they're dealing with in the games. And yet they're in denial, and they say their game is not political, even though obviously Call of Duty has political dimensions. I suppose that the easy way out for the developers would be to say that they're making games that are not only kind of imperialist in tone, but that also try to look at the corruption of the CIA, for example, like in the game Black Ops 2 with Manuel Noriega. We see CIA operatives planting drugs in Noriega's bags and framing him for crimes that he did not commit. So the corruption of the CIA, the corruption of the U.S. government, the corruption of U.S. forces is frequently an element of these games. So you could say, they do have critical elements. They don't just present a pro-United States worldview, for example, but rather show some of the dangers and problematic aspects of U.S. interventionism. So that might be the justification or the excuse that the game developers would use. But I think that in reality, of course, they're making games that frequently do reflect the dominant political ideology of the United States, in spite of those kind of exceptional critiques that might be included. So in a sense, I think it's to evade their responsibility for taking part in that political process, that it's easier to just say, oh, no, it's not political. It's all for pretend. It's all just imagination. It doesn't have any political implications. But I don't believe that. I think that absolutely video games have political implications. As far as is there a chance for developers to embrace political discourse through games, I think absolutely. But it can be difficult with AAA games. It can be very difficult with military-themed games. But I see wonderful opportunities for serious games, that are about political topics. And we could think about Gonzalo Frasca's game September 12th as a classic example of a serious game that does an incredible job of taking on political topics in a critical way. There are games about undocumented immigration to the United States, games like Turista Fronterizo, which is border tourist, or another game called Borders, which are games that are sympathetic to undocumented immigrants and the struggles that they face, or even more popular independent game Papers, Please is also about immigration and set in a fictionalized Eastern European republic. But it takes on some very significant political issues in a serious and thoughtful and non-stereotypical way. So again, when thinking about, is there any hope for better representation, more nuanced representation, for a properly political video game that really tackles these issues, I see that hope in independent developers. I'm not seeing a lot coming out of the AAA titles in the game industry.
I'd like
Ok.
to...
Eu vou traduzir rapidinho, então.
Traduz. Vai.
O Philip fala também que gostou da pergunta do Alexander e ressaltou que existe também uma espécie de mecanismo retórico, né, que os desenvolvedores vão utilizar para dizer que o jogo não é político, ou pelo menos não assume um lado dentro da disputa, porque eles também criticam os Estados Unidos como corruptos, e como... Eu vou mutar a Falcão aqui rapidinho. Como corruptos, e também tem uma crítica aos Estados Unidos, né? Mas que a gente sabe que, se a gente for analisar os outros aspectos, a gente vai ver que os jogos se enquadram dentro de uma perspectiva ideológica dos Estados Unidos, né? Como a ideologia dominante alinhada com os Estados Unidos, apesar dessas críticas pontuais. E aí ele fala também que ele acredita, obviamente, que os jogos são políticos, né? E ele essa retórica, esse discurso de que não há política nos jogos é um sintoma mesmo dessa falta de reconhecimento, e cita que sim, respondendo ao Alexander, que existe possibilidade dos jogos incorporarem essa questão política nas suas narrativas, mas que isso é difícil devido às pressões da indústria, que a gente vai muito provavelmente encontrar isso no mundo indie, né, nos jogos independentes. Ele cita alguns exemplos, né, o Fronteiriços, que é um jogo mexicano, o Borders também, que os dois jogos falam sobre imigrantes, né, o Papers, Please, que a maioria das pessoas já conhece. Ele cita o jogo do Gonzalo Frasca, que é um jogo chamado September 12, né, o 12 de setembro, e é isso, fala que é muito mais provável a gente encontrar isso no mercado indie, né, nos jogos independentes.
I'd like to follow up this with a comment by Leandro Lima, which is this one. I'm going to translate to Portuguese. A negação das posições políticas e da política pelos trabalhadores de videogame, né, nas companhias de mainstream é um problema que provavelmente vem da cultura gamer tóxica e do fato de que os jogos são entendidos, eu tô elaborando, tá? Entendidos apenas como entretenimento. And then Leandro makes another comment in Portuguese, which I'm gonna turn into a question because it's an interesting comment. I kind of gave up thinking about the production of AAA as a place of political, I don't know, doing. However, in this denial, you can read Portuguese, right?
Yes, 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 absolutely.
Okay. So the thing is, it's about the potency. I think Leandro, por favor, me corrija se eu estiver entendendo errado, tá? But the appropriation of playing, even if it's a AAA game. But I myself, I have, I don't know, I have mixed feelings about this stance, because I think this stance actually deflects the exempt stance of the industry, and I would like to ask you what you think of this.
I understand the desire to give up on the AAA industry as a place for producing, effective or meaningful political messages. I understand that. I think that it is, unfortunate, and I think that it's an easy way out, that game developers and the major players of the game industry are denying a responsibility that they do have in influencing political discourse globally and not just in their own countries. I think that it also relates to, there was another question in the chat about whether game developers use a layer of irony or parody in their expressions in order to cover up the actual ideological intentions that are underlying their works. And I think that is true, yes, that these are excuses that game developers use and say it's all just imaginary, we don't have to account for the political implications, but that is simply evading their actual responsibility that they have in the ways that their products are influencing geopolitics. I guess in thinking about one game that when I think of a AAA game that really tried to do something, like I think of other independent games, like This War of Mine is another kind of anti-war game. And one game that tried to do that was Spec Ops: The Line. Spec Ops: The Line was a war game But as the player continues, you lose a limb, for example, lose your arm and you have to go on playing, or the members of your very small platoon get killed as it goes on, and you have to make decisions where there's no simply right decision. The only decisions you can make are bad decisions, and they're going to have consequences. And that, in a sense, was an attempt, at least by the AAA game industry, to create a war game that questions the validity of war, that questions the ideology of intervention. So, if I were to hold up hope that maybe, and there's room in the industry for games like that, like Spec Ops: The Line, but they're very few and far between. I could say that.
Okay, Philip, we were going to close exactly with Karina's question, which you just answered. So I'm just going to translate your answer to the chat. Bom, então o Philip estava comentando justamente sobre a questão da representação, né? Ele citou 2 jogos que de alguma forma tentam dialogar com uma representação um pouco mais, digamos assim, nuançada, né, uma representação mais cuidadosa da guerra, que é o This War of Mine, né, que coloca ali você na perspectiva da pessoa que está sitiado, né, numa cidade, e cita também o Spec Ops: The Line, que é um jogo que de alguma forma tenta questionar alguns parâmetros dos jogos de guerra, mas ressalta um problema que está justamente na pergunta da Karina, que é a questão da ironia, né? Ela pergunta ali se a ironia pode ser usada como um subterfúgio, né? Como um disfarce para você colocar representações problemáticas no jogo. Ela fala da questão do sexismo, do racismo e do imperialismo, e no Spec Ops: The Line eu imaginaria que seria uma questão de você propor que existem questões na guerra, que não é exatamente do jeito que ela é retratada em outros jogos, mas que o Spec Ops: The Line também não oferece resposta, né? Qualquer escolha que você fizer, você está, digamos assim, você causa uma tragédia, né? Então, eu vejo essa questão da ironia aí também, que eu acho que é mais ou menos o que o Philip ressaltou na resposta dele.
Excellent. So I think that concludes our Q&A. I would ask of you if you have something to say as your final remarks, and yeah, this is the question. I'll thank you in the sequence.
Great, thank you. I just want to say thanks again, Thiago, and thank you, Ivan, for being here, for the invitation to speak with you all. It's really a great opportunity for me. I would love to continue the dialogue. I invite anybody who is here to contact me anytime. You can find my email online. Just Google me, you'll find me, and please feel free to contact me. I would love to keep the dialogue going, and I'm looking forward to attending the rest of the talks in the series. So thank you for putting it together and for inviting me.
Thank you, Philip. It was a very great talk. The chat really liked it.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I'd love to get a copy of the chat too, because I barely had time to read through it. So if there's any way for me to get a copy of all the comments, I'd love to get some more time.
We'll try that.
Great.
Yeah, we'll do that. Então, gente, ele disse que, eu acho que vale a pena dizer isso, ele disse que foi bacana e que quem quiser entrar em contato com ele, fica à vontade. E assim, dada a nossa experiência, eu vou dizer que é verdade, tá? Então mandem e-mail para ele mesmo, porque ele responde. Ele é um cara fascinante nesse sentido, assim, muito. I'm telling people you are very gracious because we didn't even meet properly, but you are here talking to us, and it was a very easy speech, very easy lecture to set up. So I wanted to thank you for that. It's very important for us to be able to hear from you and to be able to actually talk, to have a dialogue with you. I think we can collaborate and we can go further like this. So it's been a pleasure thank you. Quero agradecer a Ivan também, que nem estava assim, scheduled para estar aí, mas está aí. Então, brigadão, Ivan. Foi sensacional. Gente, muito obrigado por todos que estão aí. Por favor, se inscrevam aí no canal, deem like, sigam a gente está sempre mandando mais conteúdo nesse mesmo formato, né? A Metagame Speaker Series continua na próxima semana, na segunda-feira, dia 8, às 18 horas, igual dessa vez, com Thomas Zapperley, que vai fazer uma palestra sobre pornografia e videogame. Eu não tenho o título da palestra aqui não, mas a gente divulga no Twitter e nas redes sociais, então sigam a gente aí. Muito obrigado a todos e tenham uma excelente semana aí de fevereiro sem carnaval. Então é isso aí. Philip, please remain there. I will close up the stream and we'll talk in a few. Valeu, pessoal. Um abraço.
Valeu, gente. Obrigadão aí. Muito bom.
Muito obrigado.